Dawn broke quietly over the rugged Albanian hills on April 6, 1939. Arben, a young shepherd from Durrës, watched the sea glisten with uneasy light. Rumors traveled faster than the spring wind. Italian ships, hundreds of them, moving eastward across the Adriatic. Villagers whispered of Mussolini's desire for empire, of troops gathering in Bari and Brindisi. That morning, Arben's ship stood restless, sensing tension in the air. His father said nothing, but his silence was heavy. By evening, the faint thrum of engines could already be heard, distant but unmistakable. "They're coming," Arben murmured. The air itself seemed to tighten, thick with the weight of prophecy. Across the water, Italy's black shirts prepared to seize a land they considered their own legacy of Rome, oblivious to the lives their march would trample by sunrise.
At first light, on April 7th, the horizon turned black, a wall of steel emerging from the sea. Italian warships approached Durrës, their decks alive with soldiers and equipment. Arben stood among the villagers on the cliffs, transfixed as the fleet unleashed a low, thunderous salute. "Santa Maria," an old fisherman muttered, crossing himself. Inside the port, Albanian resistance forces, barely 6,000 men, scrambled to their positions. General Gustav von Meivelet refused to surrender, though he knew the odds were hopeless. The roar of naval guns tore through the coastal silence, and dust rose from shattered walls. Arben's chest pounded with disbelief. By midday, Italian Marines poured ashore under a haze of smoke, planting the tricolor flag. Within hours, Durrës, the gateway to Albania, was theirs. The shepherd turned from the sea, his homeland already slipping from his grasp.
Gunfire cracked across the sand. A handful of Albanian soldiers held their ground behind overturned carts and crates, defying the landing forces. The sound of machine guns ricocheted off the ruined harbor walls. Arben, driven by instinct, dragged an injured boy to cover. He saw Colonel Abbas Kupi shouting orders amidst chaos, rallying the men. Their courage burned like fire, yet the Italian advance was relentless. Tanks rolled off landing craft, crushing cobblestones under iron treads. "Fall back to the hills!" someone cried. As afternoon faded, resistance faltered. Smoke and sorrow cloaked the port. The last shots echoed as dusk descended. Arben looked back one final time, the Italian flag rising over the citadel, a red wound against a gray sky. That was the moment he understood. Albania's defense would not be measured in victories, but in defiance.
By nightfall, the village roads filled with refugees. Women carried bundles of grain. Children clung to their fathers' coats. Arben led his flock and an elderly neighbor up narrow trails toward Cruce. He turned once to see the sea below, glowing under distant fires. The hum of Italian planes circled like vultures, sending tremors through the valley. In the dark, whispers of betrayal spread. Some officials had fled. Others pledged allegiance to Italy. "We are alone now," muttered Arben's uncle, clutching a battered rifle. The cold mountain air cut deep, but the shepherd's heart burned with quiet anger. The invasion had lasted only hours, yet it felt as if centuries of independence were dissolving overnight. Across Albania, farms, cities, and schools stood still, listening to the echo of marching boots.
In Tirana, King Zog I faced the inevitable. On April 8th, his government around him crumbled like dry leaves. The Italian ambassador, Francesco Giacomoni, conveyed demands from Mussolini, surrender and submission. Zog's wife, Queen Geraldine, held their infant son as the palace staff hastily packed. "We will return," the king vowed, his voice hollow. Outside, columns of Italian troops approached the capital, greeted by forced smiles and uneasy silence. By evening, Zog's motorcade slipped away toward Greece, headlights dimmed. Arben, hidden among exiles, watched from the roadside. The royal car passed without ceremony. No banners, no farewell. only the quiet despair of a nation witnessing its monarch vanish into the night. Tirana fell without a fight. The shepherd closed his eyes, imagining the crown rolling onto foreign soil, glinting under a pitiless sky.
As Easter dawned in Rome, Mussolini stood on the Palazzo Venezia balcony declaring victory. The Duce's conquest of Albania, announced on Good Friday, was his offering to the fascist empire he imagined. Streets filled with cheering crowds, banners waved beneath the Fasciolitorio. Yet beneath the parade's pageantry lay insecurity, the desire to emulate Hitler's swift dominance. In Durrës, Italian soldiers distributed leaflets proclaiming a union of brotherhood, even as they disarmed the last Albanian garrisons. Arben listened to a radio seized from an Italian officer. The voice from Rome praised unity and destiny. He switched it off. The language of empire sounded hollow against the cries of his displaced neighbors. The shepherd swore silently that one day Albania would speak for itself again.
Weeks passed. The tricolor flew now over every government building. Italian patrols roamed streets once guarded by local watchmen. Schools reopened under new banners, textbooks rewritten in Italian tone. Arben returned to his village, finding soldiers camped in the meadows where his sheep once grazed. He quietly offered milk to a hungry corporal, who thanked him in broken Albanian. For a brief moment, Arben saw the weary humanity beneath the uniform. Yet the occupation's shadow lengthened. New taxes, arrests, and propaganda. In May, Mussolini proclaimed Albania united with Italy under King Victor Emmanuel III. The shepherd stood in the churchyard, watching as the Italian flag replaced his own. His fists clenched until his nails drew blood. "The storm is not over," he whispered. "It has just begun."
In the months that followed, small acts of resistance bloomed across the countryside. Arben joined shepherds who smuggled messages to northern tribes, refusing to cooperate. In Leger and Shoder, priests hid arms in church crypts. Italian outposts reported sabotage, cut lines, missing supplies, murmurs from the mountains. One afternoon, Arben met a teacher named Mira, who whispered, "Words are our first weapon." Together, they carved leaflets denouncing occupation, scattering them at night across the town square. As dawn rose, they watched from afar as Italian soldiers tore them down, unread. "Still," Mira said, smiling faintly, "someone saw." Beneath the boots of empire, seeds of defiance took root. Albania's heart beat quietly, waiting for the next storm Europe would unleash.
By late 1939, Europe trembled. Hitler had devoured Poland, and lightning seemed to strike from Berlin to the Balkans. In occupied Tirana, Italian officers boasted that their mission was complete, yet rumors persisted. Mussolini's gaze had turned toward Greece. Arben listened to foreign broadcasts describing entire nations falling overnight. The mountains offered silence, but not peace. "This is not the end," Mira said. "It's the beginning of something crueler." They watched supply trains roll south through the valleys, their whistles echoing like warnings. Soldiers grew stricter, suspicion deeper. The shepherd now saw how his country's invasion was merely the opening note of a far greater symphony of war, one that would consume them all before it was finished.
In 1940, Mussolini's armies marched once more, this time into Greece, from the same land he claimed as triumph. Arben and Mira, now part of an underground network, watched columns depart into the mist. They knew what waited beyond the mountains: resistance and ruin. Months later, news came back. Italy's failed advance, retreats, humiliation. For the first time since the invasion, Arben allowed himself to hope. "Empires rise quickly," he said, "but freedom waits longer." He looked toward the burned hills where his flock once roamed. Beneath the ashes, a stubborn seed endured. Albania had fallen in a week, yet the soul of its people had not. As the thunder of greater war roared to the west, Arben turned his eyes toward tomorrow, the promise that one day they would stand free again.